Hi there, I'm a historian. If you're having trouble sleeping tonight, I think my story might just help you drift off. For now, all you need to do is close your eyes. And if you have headphones nearby, go ahead and put them on. Let my voice, and the sound of rain, carry you gently into sleep. Now then, let's begin. The first blush of dawn was a shy thing in the royal chambers, creeping through the narrow leaded panes of the high windows like a hesitant lover. It didn't burst in with a fanfare of trumpets and sunbeams. No, that was reserved for the grand halls and the king's own waking. Here in the more intimate, though no less opulent confines where our subject Alara lay nestled, the light was a soft, pearly gray, just enough to chase away the deepest shadows and hint at the world beyond the heavy velvet drapes. The air cool and still from the night carried faint, almost imperceptible whispers of the waking palace. A distant clatter of pots from the kitchens, perhaps, or the soft scuff of a servant's slippered foot on stone sounds that were less interruptions and more a gentle hum, the slow turning of the great clockwork of medieval life. Alara stirred not with a jolt, but with the languid grace of a cat stretching after a long nap, his limbs accustomed to the soft embrace of fine linen and goose down unfolded slowly. The bed, a magnificent affair, carved with intricate beasts and draped in rich tapestries, was a world unto itself. It was a place of comfort, certainly, but also a gilded cage, a stage where the most private moments were in a way still part of the grand performance of courtly existence. He blinked his eyes, adjusting to the muted light, and for a moment the heavy velvet canopy above him seemed to swallow the last vestiges of dream. There was no urgent summons, no shrill alarm to rip him from slumber. His mornings were his own, at least for these first precious moments, a luxury afforded to those whose primary duty was to be presentable, pleasing, and perfectly poised. The first order of the day, as it always was the ritual of cleansing. A soft cough from beyond the screen that shielded his sleeping alcove signaled the arrival of Lysander, his personal attendant. Lysander, a man whose quiet efficiency bordered on the supernatural, moved with the silent swiftness of a shadow. He carried a silver ewer, and basin the water within warmed just so, emitting a faint whisper of rosewater and lavender. Alara sat up, pushing aside the silken sheets. The cool air touched his skin, a refreshing contrast to the warmth of the bed. Lysander poured the water a gentle cascade into the basin, and then offered a soft linen cloth. Alara dipped his hands, the water feeling like liquid silk against his skin. He splashed his face, letting the cool, fragrant droplets awaken him more fully than any harsh light could. There was a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips as he dried his face. The scent of roses clung to him, a delicate perfume that would subtly announce his presence throughout the day, a fragrant calling card in a world that often smelled of wood smoke horses and unwashed humanity. For his teeth, there was a small, carefully trimmed twig of a hazelnut tree, its end frayed into a brush, accompanied by a mixture of powdered herbs and salt. It wasn't exactly minty fresh, but it did the trick, leaving his mouth feeling clean, if a little earthy. Lysander then produced a small, intricately carved ivory comb, its teeth smooth and polished. Alara's hair, dark and thick, was a point of pride, and Lysander painstakingly worked through it, untangling any knots, leaving it smooth and gleaming. It was a simple act, yet it spoke volumes of the care taken, the meticulous attention to detail that defined his existence. Every strand, every pore, every fold of fabric was considered, for he was not merely a man, but an extension of the household's prestige, a living ornament. Once the initial ablutions were complete, the matter of dressing began. This was less a chore and more a quiet ceremony, a slow dawning of the day's persona. Lysander presented the garments with a reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. First, the softest linen undergarments, cool and breathable against the skin. Then, the tunic, often of fine wool, or on special days, shimmering silk dyed in hues of deep sapphire or rich emerald. Today, it was a muted forest green, a color that complemented his dark hair and pale skin. Each layer was carefully smoothed, each fold adjusted by Lysander's expert hands. There were no buttons to fumble with, no zippers to snag. Instead, laces and ties secured the garments, a more intricate, time-consuming process that reinforced the idea that time for Alara was a luxury to be savored, not rushed. The hose fitted snugly to his legs were next followed by soft leather shoes, simple in design but exquisitely crafted. Over it all, a short, sleeveless surcoat, perhaps embroidered with a subtle, almost invisible pattern, completed the ensemble. The clothing was designed for comfort and ease of movement, yet it also subtly hinted at his status. He wasn't a knight in clanking armor, nor a peasant in homespun roughage. His attire spoke of a life lived indoors, of refined pursuits and gentle company. It was the uniform of a courtier, a silent declaration of his place within the intricate social hierarchy. He stood still, a living mannequin, as Lysander made the final adjustments, pulling a stray thread here, smoothing a wrinkle there, ensuring every element was perfect. It was a dance they performed every morning, a silent ballet of service and acceptance. As the last tie was fastened, Alara would often drift into a quiet contemplation of the day ahead. There was no grand agenda, no pressing appointments to dictate his every move. His days were largely shaped by the whims of his patron the Duke, or the flow of courtly life. He might be summoned for a quiet conversation to read aloud from a favored manuscript, or simply to provide a calming presence during a tense meeting. Other days might be filled with more leisurely pursuits, a game of chess in the solar, a stroll through the Duke's meticulously manicured gardens, or perhaps an hour spent practicing a new melody on the lute. His life was one of elegant idleness, a golden cage with silken linings. He was a beautiful object, a living work of art admired and cared for, but ultimately owned. There was a certain quiet dignity in his acceptance of this role. He wasn't a prisoner, not in the traditional sense. He was respected, provided for, and lived a life of luxury that most common folk could only dream of. Yet the subtle threads of expectation, the unspoken duties were always there, a silken leash that kept him tethered to the Duke's will. He understood the unspoken contract comfort and security in exchange for companionship and a certain unspoken availability. It was a bargain struck not with words, but with glances, with gestures, with the very air of the court. And so, as the morning light grew a little stronger, painting faint patterns on the stone floor, Alara would take a deep, slow breath, inhaling the scent of rosewater and polished wood. The day had truly begun. He would then move to a small, cushioned bench near the window, gazing out at the inner courtyard. From this vantage point, he could observe the gradual awakening of the palace. Stable boys leading horses to water their hooves, clattering softly on the cobblestones. The distant rhythmic thud of a carpenter's hammer. The faint, high-pitched laughter of children from another wing, perhaps the Duke's own offspring. Their innocence a stark contrast to the complex web of adult relationships that defined his own existence. He was an observer, a quiet presence, a silent witness to the unfolding drama of the day. His thoughts, if they could be called thoughts, were less about personal desires and more about the rhythm of the household, the subtle shifts in mood that he had learned to read with an almost intuitive understanding. Sometimes a servant would arrive with a light breakfast, a small loaf of fresh bread still warm from the oven, a slice of soft cheese, and a cup of watered wine, or on rare occasions, a sweet fruit juice. He would eat slowly, savoring each bite. his movements deliberate and unhurried. There was no need to rush. Time was a river that flowed gently through his days, sometimes quickening its pace when the Duke's attention turned to him, but mostly meandering, allowing for quiet reflection. This morning meal was often the only time he was truly alone, a brief respite before the subtle demands of his position began to assert themselves. It was in these moments of solitude that he could truly be himself, unobserved, unjudged, if only for a fleeting while. The sounds from outside the chamber grew louder, more distinct. The clatter of armor, the murmur of voices, the occasional bark of a hound. The palace was fully awake now, a hive of activity, each person playing their part in the intricate machinery of medieval life. Alara, having completed his morning rituals, was ready to step out of his private sanctuary and into the larger world of the court. He was clean, well-dressed, and composed a picture of quiet elegance. He was ready to be seen, to be present, to fulfill the unspoken duties that defined his days. The sun, now a little higher, cast a warmer glow through the window, banishing the last of the dawn's pearly gray. The day, with all its subtle expectations and quiet routines, had truly arrived. And Alara, the male concubine, was ready to meet it one perfectly poised step at a time. As the palace truly stirred, Alara stepped out of his private chamber, the scent of rosewater trailing faintly behind him, like a gentle ghost. The corridor outside, though still quiet, hummed with a different sort of energy now. Footfalls grew more frequent, the distant murmur of voices more distinct. It was a subtle shift, like the turning of a great invisible key, unlocking the various functions of the day. His first stop was often the great hall, not to participate in any grand morning rituals, but to merely observe, to be seen, a living part of the court's tapestry. It was less about doing and more about being a vital distinction in his world. The great hall, usually a cacophony of sound during the day, was still in its contemplative phase. Servants were busy arranging tables, sweeping rushes, ensuring everything was pristine for the midday meal. The morning light filtered through tall, arched windows, painted stripes of gold across the polished stone floor. Alara moved with an easy grace, his steps almost silent, drawing a respectful nod from a passing scullery maid, a deferential bow from a young squire still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He wasn't a figure of authority, not truly, but he was a figure of quiet importance, a beloved possession of the Duke, and that carried its own weight. To displease Alara, even inadvertently, was to risk the Duke's displeasure, and that was a fate few dared to invite. Sometimes, if the Duke was feeling particularly amiable, or had a quiet moment before his more pressing duties, Alara might be summoned to the Duke's private study. These were often the most intimate interactions, not in a romantic sense, but in a shared intellectual space. The Duke, a man of formidable intelligence who sometimes found the banalities of court life tedious, appreciated Alara's sharp wit and broad knowledge. Alara wasn't just a pretty face. He was a well-read companion, a quiet-sounding board. He might read aloud from an ancient text, his voice low and melodic, or engage in a gentle debate about the latest philosophical treatise that had made its way to the Duke's library. These were the moments when Alara felt less like an ornament and more like a person valued for his mind as much as his appearance. The air in the study would be thick with the scent of old parchment and beeswax, a comforting aroma that spoke of accumulated wisdom and quiet contemplation. He would sit on a cushioned stool, the Duke in his grand carved chair, the only sounds the rustle of pages and the soft crackle of the embers in the hearth. Other times, his morning duties might involve attending a meal. Not the bustling, noisy affair of the common hall, but a more select gathering in a smaller dining room. Here the conversations were more hushed, the forks clinking against plates with a delicate precision. Alara would sit at the Duke's side, perhaps offering a witty aside when prompted, or simply listening his presence a subtle declaration of the Duke's taste and refinement. He knew how to blend into the background when necessary, becoming an elegant fixture, and how to subtly engage when his input was desired. It was a delicate dance, a constant negotiation of presence and absence, speaking and silence. He had perfected the art of being there without being there, if you catch my drift. A sort of social camouflage. Beyond these more formal interactions, Ilara's day was punctuated by periods of purposeful leisure. He wasn't just decorative, he was cultivated. Music was a significant part of his life. He often retreated to a smaller antechamber, one with good acoustics and a comfortable window seat, to practice on his lute. The plucked strings would fill the space with a sweet, melancholic melody, sometimes a popular court tune, other times an ancient air he'd learned from a wandering minstrel. The music was a balm, a way to express emotions that couldn't be outwardly displayed, a private language spoken between his fingers and the resonating wood of the instrument. He often imagined the notes floating out of the open window, carrying his unspoken feelings beyond the castle walls, though of course they merely dissipated into the bustling courtyard. Poetry was another solace. He spent hours poring over illuminated manuscripts, his fingers tracing the delicate script, his mind absorbing the rhythms and rhymes of ancient verses. Sometimes he composed his own, not for public consumption, but for his own quiet pleasure. Little odes to beauty, to the fleeting nature of time, or perhaps to the quiet ache of unexpressed longing. He would meticulously ink the words onto parchment, his hand steady and precise, delighting in the neat lines and the delicate flourishes. It was a clandestine rebellion, a quiet act of self-expression in a life largely dictated by others. These poems were his secrets, safely locked away in his mind, and in the few carefully hidden scrolls in his chest. Chess was another favored pastime, often played with one of the Duke's more intellectual advisors, or sometimes if the Duke was in a playful mood with the Duke himself. The game was a battle of wits, a strategic dance of pieces on a board, and Ilara excelled at it. He enjoyed the mental challenge the way the game demanded foresight and cunning. Each move was a puzzle, each decision a tiny victory or a minor defeat. It was a welcome escape from the ambiguities of courtly life, a world where the rules were clear and the consequences immediate. There were no hidden motives on a chessboard, only logic and strategy. If the weather permitted a quiet stroll through the palace gardens was a common diversion. The Duke's gardens were a masterpiece of medieval landscaping, a geometrically precise arrangement of fragrant herbs, colorful flowers, and neatly trimmed hedges. Ilara would walk slowly, breathing in the fresh air, admiring the industrious bees buzzing around the lavender, the delicate butterflies flitting between the roses. He knew the names of many of the plants, their medicinal properties, and their symbolic meanings, knowledge he had acquired from ancient herbals. He found a quiet peace among the growing things, a sense of timelessness that contrasted sharply with the ever-shifting currents of courtly favor. The scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine was a welcome antidote to the musty air of the castle's interior. These leisure pursuits, seemingly undirected, were in fact crucial to his role. They kept his mind sharp, his demeanor calm, and his spirit relatively content. Aboard Concubine was an unappealing one, after all. He was expected to be witty, engaging, and knowledgeable, capable of holding an intelligent conversation on a wide range of topics, from courtly gossip to ancient history. His days, therefore, were less about doing grand deeds and more about being a pleasant, cultivated companion, a living repository of refined tastes and agreeable conversation. It was a life of structured idleness, a golden thread woven into the fabric of the Duke's court. Sometimes, during the long afternoon hours, he would retire to a small antechamber adjacent to the Duke's private solar. Here, warmed by a gentle fire, he might spend hours sketching or perhaps embroidering a small, intricate design on a piece of silk, a skill he had picked up from the Duchess's ladies-in-waiting, finding the meticulous work soothing. The quiet focus on the needle and thread the steady rhythm of creation allowed his mind to drift to settle like dust motes in a sunbeam. It was a gentle way to pass the time, a productive form of waiting. He was always, in essence, waiting. Waiting for a summons, waiting for the dinner bell, waiting for the day to slowly unfurl. His life was a slow dance marked by predictable rhythms, a waltz between solitude and social obligation. He had learned to savor these quiet moments, to find contentment in the predictable patterns of his days. There was a certain liberation in knowing his path was largely set, freeing him from the anxieties of ambition or the struggles for power that consumed so many others in the court. He was outside that particular fray, an observer, rather than a participant in the cutthroat politics. His power lay not in his ability to command, but in his ability to charm, to soothe, to simply be. And so, as the afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the chamber walls with shades of amber and rose, Ilara would set aside his book or his lute, a quiet sigh escaping his lips. The day with its expected duties and cherished diversions was gently winding down, preparing for the evening's embrace. The gentle descent of the afternoon sun, painting the chamber walls with shades of amber and rose, wasn't just a pretty show. It was the palace's subtle signal for the day's great unwinding. For Ilara, this meant a shift in focus, a quiet preparation for the evening's unique demands. If the daytime was about maintaining an aura of cultivated grace, the evening was about embodying a specific kind of allure, a refined comfort designed for one person in particular. It was like the final delicate brushstrokes on a masterpiece, ensuring every detail was perfect for the connoisseur. The first step in this evening transformation was the bath. Not a quick splash, but a proper, unhurried immersion, a ritual designed to wash away the dust of the day and prepare both body and mind. Lysander, ever the silent guardian of Ilara's comfort, would already have prepared the bathing chamber. Steam thick and fragrant with infused herbs, perhaps chamomile for soothing, or a hint of mint for invigoration, would curl from a large wooden tub, inviting and warm. The water sourced from the palace's own well and heated over a nearby brazier would be infused with special bath salts, ground from dried flowers and aromatic barks. It was a sensory delight, a luxurious haze that enveloped him the moment he stepped into the room. Ilara would shed his day clothes, allowing Lysander to carefully fold and set them aside. Stepping into the tub was like entering a different world, one where the clamor of the court faded into a distant hum. He would sink into the warm water, letting the soothing heat seep into his muscles, easing any lingering tension from hours spent sitting, reading, or playing the lute. He'd close his eyes, listening to the gentle lapping of the water, the almost imperceptible crackle of the herbs on the brazier. Lysander would then begin to gently wash his hair, working a mild scented soap through the dark strands. The rhythmic motion, the soft touch was incredibly relaxing, almost hypnotic. It was a moment of profound vulnerability and profound trust, a quiet understanding between master and servant. After his hair was rinsed and wrapped in a soft linen towel, Lysander would help him out of the tub. Ilara's skin, now clean and glowing, would be carefully dried with thick, warm towels, leaving it soft and supple. Then came the anointing, a practice as old as time, giving it a modern twist. Lysander would select small stoppered vials from a polished wooden box. These weren't just any oils. They were carefully concocted blends of precious essences. A light rose oil for his body, a whisper of sandalwood for his pulse points, perhaps a touch of jasmine oil for his hair. These oils were absorbed into his skin, leaving it not greasy, but subtly gleaming. Smelling faintly of an exotic garden, it was like seasoning a delicate dish, adding just the right notes to enhance its natural flavor, ensuring he was not only clean, but utterly alluring, radiating a quiet, natural warmth. Once anointed, it was time for the evening attire. This was typically simpler, softer, and more intimate than his daytime clothes. Silken robes, perhaps in deep, rich colors like plum or midnight blue, or a tunic of the finest unadorned linen that draped elegantly over his form. The fabrics felt exquisite against his newly cleansed skin, a sensual pleasure in itself. Lysander would help him into these garments, ensuring they lay perfectly, every fold just so. There were no elaborate fastenings, no cumbersome layers. The aim was comfort, ease, and a certain unstudied grace. He wasn't dressing for the court, but for a potentially private audience, and the attire reflected that intimacy. As he dressed, the sounds of the palace outside shifted once more. The clatter of the midday had subsided, replaced by a more hushed, anticipatory murmur. Footfalls became softer voices lower. Torches would be lit in the hallways, casting dancing shadows and a warm, inviting glow. The smell of roasting meats and simmering spices would begin to waft from the kitchens, promising the evening feast. It was the hour when the day's duties were largely concluded, and the focus turned towards relaxation, entertainment, and personal connections. Alara would then move to a small, comfortable chair by the window, the soft evening light still lingering in the sky. This was a moment of quiet anticipation. He might sip a cup of warm spiced wine, its sweet warmth a pleasant counterpoint to the cool evening air. His thoughts would often drift, not to grand schemes or ambitions, but to the delicate dance of human connection. Would the Duke summon him? Would their evening be one of quiet companionship, shared stories, or perhaps something more? He harbored no illusions about his position. He was a comfort, a confidant, a source of aesthetic pleasure. His worth was measured in the Duke's contentment, and he took pride in fulfilling that role with grace and precision. It wasn't love, not in the traditional sense, but a complex tapestry of affection, respect, and mutual understanding. The waiting was never truly anxious, more a gentle hum of readiness. He had mastered the art of being present, yet detached, allowing the tides of the court to flow around him without drowning him in their currents. He was a buoy, steadfast and beautiful, designed to ride the waves. His mind, usually so active with poetry and music, would quiet, entering a state of serene receptiveness. He would listen to the fading sounds of the palace, the last chirps of birds settling in the eaves, the distant chime of the chapel bell marking the close of vespers. The world outside his chamber was preparing for its long night's sleep, but for Alara the evening was just beginning its quiet unfolding. His role was subtle, his influence indirect, but no less significant. He was the soft landing, the gentle hand, the calming voice in a world often defined by harsh edges and sharp words. And as the last slivers of twilight faded from the sky, and the chamber was illuminated only by the soft glow of a few carefully placed oil lamps, Alara would rise. He would take a moment to look at his reflection in a polished silver mirror, not out of vanity, but out of a final professional assessment. His hair was perfectly in place. His skin glowed with health. His robes draped just so. He was ready. He would then settle onto a cushioned chaise, perhaps picking up a small, beautifully bound book of poetry, or simply closing his eyes, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. He wouldn't wait by the door, nor pace nervously. That would be undignified, unbefitting his role. Instead, he would project an aura of calm readiness, like a perfectly tuned instrument, waiting for the maestro's touch. The palace was falling quiet now, each chamber settling into its own nighttime routine. The cooks were finished, the guards were changing, and the great doors of the castle were barred for the night. Within this vast sleeping stone structure, Ilara waited. He was a silent sentinel of comfort, poised for whatever the twilight hours might bring, a living embodiment of the court's desire for refined companionship, a beacon of tranquility in the heart of the bustling, now quiet, medieval world. The anticipation was not a burden, but merely a part of the elegant rhythm of his days and nights, a quiet breath before the next moment unfolded. Sometimes the soft knock would come, followed by Lysander's whispered announcement, "The Duke requests your presence, master." Other times, the night would remain a quiet, solitary affair, filled only with the turning of pages or the gentle hum of contemplation. On those nights, Ilara indulged in the simple luxury of uninterrupted thought, letting his mind wander through the vast gardens of knowledge he had cultivated. It was on one such evening, as a solitary lamp cast long dancing shadows across his chamber, that his thoughts drifted from the immediate confines of the palace walls to the broader world outside a world that communicated in ways far more subtle than whispered requests or formal summons. He thought of the language of flowers. It might seem like a frivolous subject tucked away in the back of a noble's mind, but in the Middle Ages, flowers were more than just pretty things to brighten a room or adorn a lady's hair. They were a secret alphabet, a silent code understood by those in the know, weaving their way through courtly love, religious symbolism, and even political intrigue. A well-placed rose could speak volumes that 1,000 whispered words could not, and a wilting lily could convey a heartbreak more profound than any tear. It was like a game of charades played with petals, where every bloom had a story, a message, a hidden meaning just waiting to be deciphered. Take the rose, for instance, the undisputed queen of medieval flowers. You might think, oh, love, obviously. And you'd be right, mostly. But it was far more nuanced than that. A deep red rose screamed passionate, burning love, the kind that might get you banished or married, depending on the circumstances. A white rose, however, was all about purity, innocence, and heavenly love, the kind you might offer to the Virgin Mary, or perhaps to a very chaste, very unattainable crush. A pink rose that was a softer, gentler affection uttering love. A polite flirtation that wouldn't scandalize the Dowager Countess. And don't even get started on the thorns. They symbolized pain danger, or the prickles of a difficult relationship. So a bouquet of red roses with prominent thorns that wasn't just, "I love you." It was, "I love you, but you're a pain in my side, darling, and this might end badly." A witty commentary delivered without a single utterance. Then there were the lilies. These stately blooms, especially the white ones, were practically saints in floral form. They were all about purity, innocence, and virtue, often associated with the Virgin Mary and depictions of angels. If you sent someone a lily, you were basically saying, "You are utterly blameless and probably smell like heaven." Not a bad compliment, if a bit formal. The lily also symbolized royalty and power, hence its frequent appearance in heraldry, like the French fleur de lis. It was a flower that wore many crowns, both literal and metaphorical. And what about rosemary? This unassuming woody herb might not have the showy petals of a rose, but its symbolism was deeply ingrained. Rosemary meant remembrance. You'd tuck a sprig into a bridal bouquet, or carry it at a funeral, or even wear it in your hair if you wanted someone to remember you fondly, or perhaps to stop forgetting your name at court functions. It was the medieval equivalent of setting a reminder on your mental calendar, only much prettier and far more fragrant. It was the subtle way of saying, "Don't forget me. or I haven't forgotten you. In a world where memories were more fragile than parchment, the violet, small and unassuming, had its own quiet power. It symbolized humility, faithfulness, and modesty. If someone gave you violets, they weren't declaring a grand passion. They were expressing a quiet, steadfast devotion, a humble admiration. It was the flower for the secret admirer, the shy suitor, or simply a friend who admired your unassuming nature. It whispered where the rose shouted. But the language of flowers wasn't just about pretty sentiments. It could be used for far more practical, even mischievous purposes. Imagine a noble woman trapped in an arranged marriage trying to send a message to her true love across a crowded ballroom. A carefully chosen bouquet, held just so, could convey a secret meeting place, a warning, or even a daring proposal. A discarded flower trampled underfoot could signify betrayal or rejection. It was a silent telegraph, a botanical Morse code understood by those who knew the lexicon. Courtiers, ever adept at playing the game of appearances, mastered this language to perfection. A gentleman might subtly include a sprig of marigolds, symbolizing jealousy or despair. In a gift to a rival, a clever, understated insult that could only be understood by the most discerning eye. It was like sending a poisoned dart wrapped in velvet, outwardly beautiful, inwardly venomous. Beyond personal communication, flowers also played a huge role in heraldry. The coats of arms that adorned knights' shields, castle banners, and noblemen's tunics often featured floral motifs, each with a specific meaning. The thistle, rugged and thorny, symbolized defiance and independence, often adopted by Scottish nobility. The trefoil or clover with its 3 leaves represented the Holy Trinity in religious contexts, but could also stand for unity or good fortune. These weren't just pretty designs. They were statements of identity, lineage, and often aspiration. When you saw a banner with a specific flower, you knew not just whose it was, but what they stood for, or at least what they claimed to stand for. Even everyday objects were imbued with floral symbolism. Illuminated manuscripts, those painstakingly crafted books of the Middle Ages, were often decorated with intricate borders of flowers and vines. These weren't just decorative flourishes. They often echoed the text, providing a visual commentary or adding layers of symbolic meaning. A scene depicting a saint might be surrounded by lilies, a tale of courtly love by entwined roses. It was a visual poetry, a way of adding richness and depth to the written word, making the pages sing with hidden meanings. The gardeners of the medieval age, though perhaps not aware of the grand tapestry of symbolism they were creating, were nonetheless integral to this floral language. They cultivated specific varieties, nurtured rare blooms, and understood the properties of each plant, not just for their beauty, but for their deeper significance. A courtly garden was not merely a collection of plants. It was a living dictionary, a silent library of messages waiting to be read. It was a place where declarations of love, warnings of betrayal, and promises of eternal fidelity could be conveyed without a single word being spoken. Elara often wondered about the subtleties of this language. How many lovers had exchanged knowing glances over a bouquet of carefully selected blooms? How many secrets had been passed in a single dropped flower? In a world where direct communication could be dangerous, where walls had ears and spies lurked in every shadow, the silent language of flowers offered a discreet, elegant alternative. It was a testament to the ingenuity of people finding beauty and meaning, even in the simplest things, twisting nature into a profound form of expression. As the lamp continued to flicker, casting its soft, steady glow, Elara imagined the myriad silent conversations happening across the land. Each petal a whispered word, each bloom a heartfelt declaration, a secret symphony played out in vibrant hues and fragrant air. The palace might be quiet now, but the language of flowers he knew never truly slept. It continued its subtle communication even under the cloak of night. As Alara sat the flickering lamp casting its golden pool around him, his mind wandered from the delicate dance of petals to another far more arcane language that permeated the medieval world alchemy. It was a strange, shimmering realm where science mingled with magic, where the pursuit of gold often walked hand in hand with the quest for immortality, and where even the most learned men weren't entirely sure where one ended and the other began. It was, in essence, the wild, unruly teenager of what would one day become modern chemistry and medicine, full of grand ambitions and occasionally messy experiments. To the uninitiated, an alchemist's study might have seemed like a madman's lair. Bubbling retorts, coiled alembics, glowing furnaces, and shelves crammed with bizarre ingredients. Dried newt eyes, pulverized unicorn horn, or what they thought was unicorn horn. Rare minerals and foul-smelling concoctions. It smelled of sulfur-burnt sugar and 1,000 other indescribable odors that promised either enlightenment or a nasty explosion. But beneath the smoke and mirrors, a genuine quest for knowledge was underway. Alchemists weren't just trying to turn lead into gold, though that was certainly the headline act. They were early chemists pushing the boundaries of material transformation, trying to understand the very essence of matter itself. Consider Jabir ibn Hayyan, often called the father of chemistry by those in the know. He was a brilliant Islamic alchemist from centuries past, whose writings influenced European thinkers for hundreds of years. This fellow was no slouch. He developed crucial laboratory equipment and processes that we still in some form use today: distillation, crystallization, filtration, sublimation. These weren't just fancy words. They were revolutionary techniques that allowed alchemists to purify substances' separate compounds and generally get a better handle on what they were actually messing with. Imagine trying to make a perfectly clear spirit without distillation. It'd be like trying to paint a masterpiece with mud. Jabir also theorized about the composition of metals, suggesting they were made of sulfur and mercury in varying proportions. While not entirely accurate by modern standards, it was a huge leap forward from simply saying, "It's magic." Then there was Albertus Magnus, a towering figure from the 13th century, a German Dominican friar and philosopher. He was practically a Renaissance man before the Renaissance was even a twinkle in anyone's eye. Albertus wasn't just dabbling in alchemy. He was approaching it with a methodical, almost scientific rigor. He accurately described the preparation of nitric acid and was one of the first to isolate arsenic. Imagine isolating arsenic back then in a world without proper ventilation. That's a dedication, or perhaps a stubbornness, you can only marvel at. He believed alchemy could unlock secrets of nature and improve human life, not just fill coffers. He was the kind of alchemist who'd probably give you a stern lecture on proper ventilation and safety precautions, even as his own eyebrows were slightly singed. The grand prize, of course, was the Philosopher's Stone. This mythical substance was believed to be capable of transmuting base metals into gold or silver. But it wasn't just about wealth. It was also thought to be the key to the elixir of life, a potion that could cure diseases, restore youth, and grant immortality. Picture it: no more pesky colds, no more wrinkles, just eternal existence. It was the medieval equivalent of winning the lottery, finding the fountain of youth, and getting tenure at the world's most prestigious university, all in one shimmering, mysterious package. Alchemists spent lifetimes, fortunes, and sometimes their sanity trying to create it. It was the ultimate have your cake and eat it too forever dream. But beyond these grand, often elusive goals, alchemy had very real, if rudimentary, applications in medieval medicine. Many alchemists were also physicians, or at least dabblers in the healing arts. They experimented with herbal concoctions, mineral extracts, and various elixirs, trying to find cures for everything from the common cough to the dreaded plague. They were, in a way, the original pharmacists grinding, boiling, and distilling substances to create remedies. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of someone tinkering in their garage, only instead of inventing a better mousetrap. They were trying to invent a better cure for the Black Death. The success rate was, shall we say, variable. Consider the prevailing medical theory of the time, the Four Humors. This ancient Greek concept, revived and firmly entrenched in the Middle Ages, proposed that the human body was made up of four basic fluids: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness occurred when these humors became unbalanced. If you had too much blood, you were sanguine; too much yellow bile, choleric; too much phlegm, phlegmatic; and too much black bile, melancholic. This was the lens through which medieval doctors viewed every ailment. So if you were feverish, you might have too much blood. The solution: bloodletting, of course. A popular if terrifying practice where a vein was cut or leeches applied to drain off the excess bad blood. It was like trying to fix a leaky bucket by poking more holes in it. Herbal remedies were also paramount. Almost every castle and monastery had an apothecary garden brimming with plants whose properties were meticulously catalogued. Chamomile for sleep feverfew for headaches, valerian for anxiety, digitalis for the heart. Though they likely didn't understand the exact mechanism, they knew it worked for swelling. Alchemists would often distill these herbs, creating more potent extracts, or combining them with other substances to enhance their effects. It was a painstaking process, often relying on centuries of inherited knowledge trial, and sometimes fatal error. The medieval alchemist, therefore, was a fascinating paradox, a mystic and a proto-scientist, a seeker of eternal life and a practical physician. They blurred the lines between the natural and the supernatural, pushing the boundaries of human understanding with their bubbling cauldrons and cryptic texts. They might not have turned lead into gold on a grand scale, nor discovered the secret to eternal youth. But their relentless experimentation, their systematic if sometimes misguided approach to understanding materials, laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution that would follow. They were the pioneers of the laboratory, the unsung heroes who embraced the mess and the mystery, all in the hope of unraveling nature's deepest secrets. And as Alara sat in his quiet chamber, the image of a dimly lit alchemist's study, filled with the scent of strange vapors and the promise of transformation, was as captivating as any courtly romance, a testament to humanity's enduring curiosity and its eternal quest for mastery over the elements. He imagined the quiet hum of their furnaces, the meticulous weighing of strange powders, the hopeful stirring of potions under the watchful eye of the moon. It was a world of hidden power, a secret language spoken in fire and fume, far removed from the subtle whispers of the court, but just as profound in its own way. Ilara, stirring from his alchemical reverie, realized how utterly quiet his chamber had become. The last servant had long since retired, the distant sounds of the palace had faded to almost nothing, and even the rustle of rats in the walls, a surprisingly common nocturnal soundtrack, seemed to have taken a night off. This profound silence led his mind to consider another sensory experience of medieval life, one that was perhaps more omnipresent than the scent of roses or the bubbling of elixirs, the sounds of a medieval castle. Now, if you're picturing a serene, silent stone fortress, you've been watching too many historical dramas. A medieval castle, even when seemingly quiet, was actually a symphony of everyday noises, a constant hum of life that would probably drive a modern person absolutely batty. It was less a quiet sanctuary and more a bustling, self-contained village crammed into a stone shell. But let's start with the quiet, just for contrast. Imagine you're deep within the castle walls, perhaps in the dead of night, like Alara. The heavy stone walls, while great for defense, were also fantastic at muffling sound. So the first thing you'd notice is the incredible lack of outside noise. No cars, no sirens, no barking dogs from 3 streets over. Just the wind whistling around the battlements, a mournful, lonely sound that could send shivers down your spine. And then there was the guard's call. Every few hours, a watchman would bellow out a traditional cry, often something like, "All's well, Tikos," or "past midnight and all asleep," their voice echoing eerily through the courtyards and corridors. It was a comforting sound, a reminder that vigilant eyes were still awake, but also a stark punctuation mark in the vast, dark silence. But dawn brought the cacophony. Oh, the sweet, sweet cacophony. The first sounds weren't birdsong usually. They were the roosters crowing with an enthusiasm that suggested they were being paid by the decibel. And then the animals. Horses whinnying from the stables, their hooves clattering on the cobblestones as stable boys led them to water. Dogs barking not necessarily with aggression, but with the sheer joy of a new day and the possibility of a discarded scrap of bread. These weren't quiet, well-behaved pets. They were working animals, and they sounded like it. As the sun crept higher, the castle truly awakened. The kitchens became a furious symphony of their own. The clatter of iron pots, the sizzle of meat over open flames, the rhythmic thump of a mortar, and pestle grinding spices, the shouted commands of the head cook. It was a percussive masterpiece, often accompanied by the cheerful, if slightly off-key singing of scullery maids. The air would thicken with the smell of wood smoke and cooking food, a sensory feast that permeated the entire castle. You could tell what they were having for dinner just by sniffing the air around the main keep. Outside in the courtyard, the sounds shifted from culinary to practical. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer against metal shaping iron for tools or armor. The grating sound of a grindstone sharpening swords or knives. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of looms from the weaving rooms, a steady pulse indicating fabric in production. There would be the shouts of pages training in the yard, the gentle thwack of a wooden sword hitting a shield, or the more serious clatter of armor as knights prepared for drills. And of course, the constant low murmur of human voices. Conversations, laughter arguments, orders being given, all blending into a continuous, vibrant hum that bespoke of hundreds of lives intertwined. The great hall, once empty and echoing at dawn, would become a central hub of noise. During meals, it was a riot. The scraping of wooden trenchers, the clinking of pewter cups, the guttural sounds of people eating heartily, accompanied by the boisterous laughter and loud conversations of lords, ladies' knights, and retainers. Think of a very busy, very loud restaurant without any noise-dampening panels. After meals, it might host musicians filling the space with the bright plucking of a lute, the reedy wail of a shawm, or the rhythmic thump of a drum. Minstrels would tell tales, their voices rising and falling dramatically, often punctuated by the audience's cheers or groans. The very architecture of the castle played a role in its soundscape. Stone walls and floors, while durable, were terrible for acoustics. Sounds echoed, bounced, and carried in unpredictable ways. A whispered secret in one corridor might be strangely amplified in another. Footsteps on the cold stone floors created distinct sounds. The heavy clump of armored boots, the soft scuff of leather slippers, the lighter patter of bare feet. Even the wind finding its way through narrow arrow slits and poorly sealed windows created its own mournful music, a constant whisper or howl that changed with the weather. And let's not forget the drawbridge and portcullis. The slow groan of the great chains as the drawbridge was lowered or raised, followed by the heavy thud as it settled into place. the metallic scrape and crash of the portcullis, a formidable iron gate being lowered with a final echoing clang. These were sounds of security, of protection, but also a daily reminder of the castle's primary purpose as a defensive stronghold. Every opening and closing was a ritual announced by its distinctive sound. Even the church bells from the castle chapel or a nearby village would punctuate the day, marking the hours for prayer, signaling mass, or simply reminding everyone of the steady passage of time. They were the original town clocks, their chimes carrying far beyond the castle walls a sonic thread connecting the isolated fortress to the wider world. But when night truly fell and the last embers in the hearth glowed softly, the castle reverted to its primal sounds. The creaks and groans of settling timbers, the rustle of rushes on the floor as some unseen creature scurried by, the soft patter of rain against stone. The castle in its quiet moments almost seemed to breathe a living entity settling down for the night. Ilara often found himself listening to these subtle nighttime noises, distinguishing the familiar from the unexpected. The distant hoot of an owl from the surrounding woods, a lonely, evocative sound. The gentle snore of a guard just outside his door. These were the lullabies of his medieval life sounds that spoke of safety routine and the ancient rhythm of existence. It was a constant conversation between the stone, the wind, the animals, and the hundreds of people who called this fortress home. And though he cherished the profound silence of his own chamber, Ilara knew that the true sound of the castle was its persistent, bustling, charmingly noisy heartbeat. A vibrant testament to lives lived in close quarters under the watchful eye of stone and sky. Sometimes, when the palace grew too loud, too demanding, or simply too full of other people, Ilara would retreat to the library. It wasn't a grand, cavernous space filled with endless shelves like the monasteries boasted, but a respectable collection housed in a smaller, quieter wing of the Duke's private apartments. And within its hushed walls, he found refuge not just in stories and histories, but in the sheer artistry of the illuminated manuscripts themselves. These weren't your everyday paperbacks, mind you. Oh no, these were masterpieces, each one a painstaking labor of love, devotion, and occasionally aching carpal tunnel syndrome. Before the printing press came along to democratize reading and make books as common as a bad cold, every single book was a unique work of art. Hand-copied and often exquisitely decorated. It was like having a one-of-a-kind painting that also told a story, or a very fancy medieval version of a pop-up book, if the pop-ups were intricate golden leaves and tiny grumpy-looking dragons. The process of creating one of these beauties was nothing short of monumental. It all started with the parchment. Forget paper, which was still a bit of a newfangled exotic import. These books were made from animal skin, sheep, calf, or goat, meticulously cleaned, stretched taut, scraped thin and polished until it was smooth and almost translucent. It was a painstaking, often smelly process that probably involved a lot of elbow grease and a strong stomach. Imagine trying to write your history paper on a piece of dried animal hide. Suddenly, your laptop doesn't seem so bad, does it? Once the parchment was ready, it went to the scribe. This was the person with the steady hand and the endless patience tasked with copying the text word by word letter, by elegant letter. Monasteries were major centers for this work, with monks often dedicating their entire lives to reproducing sacred texts. Their fingers would ache, their eyes would strain in the dim candlelight, but they kept going, driven by faith or simply the sheer necessity of preserving knowledge. They used quills, usually goose feathers dipped in rich black ink, made from soot and gall nuts. Every stroke was precise, every line, perfectly straight sometimes, with little guidelines pricked into the parchment that would later be erased. It was like calligraphy on steroids with added spiritual dedication. But the real magic, the part that made these books illuminated, came after the scribe was done. That's when the illuminator stepped in. These were the artists, the ones who brought the pages to life with vibrant colors and glittering gold. They didn't just draw pretty pictures. They illuminated the text, making it shine quite literally. The pigments were often ground minerals, lapis lazuli for brilliant blues, malachite for greens, cinnabar for reds, all mixed with egg yolk or animal glue to bind them. It was like painting with crushed jewels. And the gold, oh the gold. This wasn't just gold paint. It was often gold leaf, ultra-thin sheets of beaten gold applied to the parchment. The illuminator would lay down a sticky base, often gesso, then carefully press the delicate gold leaf onto it. Once dry, they'd polish it with a smooth stone or a dog's tooth until it gleamed, catching the light and making the page truly glow. It was a testament to the sheer wealth and dedication poured into these books, transforming them from mere text into shimmering treasures. You couldn't just glance at these pages. You had to lean in, watch the light play across the gold, and appreciate the meticulous detail. The subjects of these illuminated manuscripts were diverse, reflecting the knowledge and interests of the medieval world. Religious texts were naturally abundant. Bibles, Psalter's books of hours, personal prayer books, often exquisitely small and portable. These were not just read. They were revered, used in daily devotions, and cherished as sacred objects. But there were also bestiaries, fascinating compendiums of real and mythical animals, each with a moral or religious lesson attached. You'd find meticulously drawn lions alongside unicorns, and detailed descriptions of elephants rubbing shoulders with sea monsters. It was zoology, with a spiritual twist often more imaginative than scientific. Herbals were another common type. Illustrated guides to medicinal plants, their properties, and how to prepare remedies. These were the medieval equivalent of your grandmother's gardening book, if your grandmother was a monk with a serious knowledge of poultices and potions. And then there were chronicles and histories recording the great deeds of kings and saints' wars and plagues, all meticulously documented and often adorned with miniature scenes of battles or coronations. Some of the most famous examples still astound us today. The Book of Kells, created by Celtic monks around the 9th century, is a masterpiece of intricate knotwork, swirling patterns, and vibrant colors, so detailed you almost need a magnifying glass to appreciate its full glory. It's like a psychedelic medieval puzzle, each page more mesmerizing than the last. And then there's Les Très Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, a book of hours. From the 15th century, famous for its stunning calendar pages depicting peasant life, courtly scenes, and the changing seasons with an almost photographic realism that was revolutionary for its time. It's like a medieval Instagram feed, only with way more sheep and much less filter. Ilara often found himself lost in these pages, not just for the stories they told, but for the sheer artistry. He'd trace the delicate lines of a dragon's wing marvel at the vibrant blues of a saint's robe, or try to decipher the subtle expressions on the faces of tiny figures in a battle scene. It was a tangible connection to the minds and hands of people who had lived centuries before him, a silent conversation across time. These books were a form of immortality, preserving not just words, but the very aesthetic spirit of an age. They stood as a testament to the value placed on knowledge and beauty in a world often perceived as grim and unlettered. For all the talk of rough living and short lives, the medieval era still found the time, the skill, and the resources to create objects of breathtaking beauty, objects designed to last for centuries, to inspire awe and devotion. And as Ilara carefully closed a heavy tome, placing it back on its shelf, he felt a profound sense of connection to these anonymous artists and scribes, the quiet heroes who kept the flame of learning and artistry burning bright. In a world of fleeting moments, these illuminated worlds were eternal, whispering their stories and shimmering with the light of ages. As Ilara gently closed the heavy manuscript, the feeling of ancient wisdom still lingering on his fingertips, his gaze drifted to the window. Beyond the castle walls, the road stretched out ribbons of dust and mud, winding through forests and across plains. These weren't just routes for armies or merchants. They were pathways for a different kind of traveler, one driven not by conquest or commerce, but by something far more profound, the pilgrim's path. Now, if you thought packing for a weekend trip was a hassle, imagine embarking on a medieval pilgrimage. This wasn't a quick hop on a comfortable coach. This was a grand adventure, a testament of faith, and sometimes a journey straight into a world of trouble. People didn't undertake these treks lightly. They were often driven by deep spiritual conviction, a promise made in a moment of despair or gratitude, or simply a fervent desire to seek blessings or penance at a holy site. It was like taking a very long, very uncomfortable walk to clear your conscience with a side of potential bandits and questionable innkeepers. The motivations for becoming a pilgrim were as varied as the wildflowers by the roadside. Some sought a cure for a lingering illness, believing that proximity to a saint's relics could work miracles. Others were doing penance for their sins, hoping that the hardship of the journey would cleanse their souls. Many simply longed for a closer connection to God, to walk in the footsteps of saints, or to witness the holy sights they'd only read about in those very illuminated manuscripts Ilara so admired. It was a tangible expression of faith, a way to put your feet where your prayers were, quite literally. The destinations were iconic, whispered with reverence across Christendom. Jerusalem, of course, the holiest of holy lands, the ultimate pilgrimage, though fraught with danger and expense, like planning a vacation to the moon. Then there was Rome, the eternal city home, to the Pope and countless martyrs' tombs. And perhaps most famously, for Europeans, Santiago de Compostela in northwest Spain, where the relics of St. James the Greater were said to rest. Thousands from humble peasants to mighty kings donned the pilgrim's scallop shell, and staff setting off on journeys that could take months, even years. But oh, the challenges. The medieval roads were, to put it mildly, an absolute nightmare. They weren't smooth asphalt ribbons. They were often little more than rutted tracks, prone to becoming impassable mud bogs in the rain or choking dust bowls in the summer. Bridges were few and far between, so pilgrims often faced dangerous river crossings. And forget about roadside assistance. If your cart broke down, you were essentially on your own, hoping a passing farmer was feeling charitable. It was the original off-road adventure without the benefit of a sturdy jeep or a GPS. Then there were the brigands. Yes, unfortunately, the roads were not just frequented by pious travelers. Bands of robbers and outlaws saw pilgrims as easy targets, often carrying valuables, donations, special relics, or simply the money for their journey, and being generally less armed and less prepared for a fight than, say, a knight on patrol. Every wooded stretch, every isolated pass held the potential for a terrifying ambush. Pilgrims often traveled in groups for safety, forming impromptu caravans, but even then, there was no guarantee. It was a bit like walking through a very scenic, very long obstacle course, where the obstacles might try to relieve you of your purse, or worse. Disease was another constant companion on the pilgrim's path. Poor sanitation contaminated water-close quarters with strangers, and the sheer exhaustion of travel made pilgrims highly susceptible to fevers, dysentery, and other grim ailments. A simple cut could turn deadly without proper care, and a nasty cough could quickly escalate into something far more sinister. Many who set out never reached their destination, falling victim to the elements or illness along the way, their journey ending in an unmarked grave by the roadside. Yet amidst these dangers, there were moments of incredible human connection and hospitality. Monasteries and hospices along popular pilgrimage routes offered shelter, food, and medical care to weary travelers. These were sanctuaries, beacons of hope in a harsh world. Villagers, too, might offer a meal or a bed, viewing it as an act of charity that would earn them favor in the eyes of God. Pilgrims relied on the kindness of strangers and often found it in unexpected places. It was a beautiful network of mutual support woven through the fabric of medieval society. The journey itself was often considered as important, if not more so, than the destination. The hardships endured, the miles walked, the dangers faced, all were seen as acts of devotion, building spiritual merit. Pilgrims wore distinctive clothing, often a simple tunic, a cloak, and a wide-brimmed hat adorned with symbols of their destination, like the scallop shell for Santiago, or a palm frond for Jerusalem. These symbols weren't just souvenirs. They were badges of honor, announcing that the wearer had undertaken a great spiritual odyssey. The social impact of these pilgrim routes was immense. They weren't just religious pathways. They were conduits for cultural exchange. Ideas, stories, songs, and even goods traveled along with the pilgrims. People from different regions, speaking different dialects, sharing different customs, would meet, interact, and influence each other. New architectural styles might spread new culinary techniques, or even new fashions. Pilgrimage routes became economic arteries, stimulating trade and fostering the growth of towns along their paths. It was the original tourist industry, only with more spiritual intention and less comfortable footwear. Ilara often mused on the mental fortitude required for such a journey. To put one foot in front of the other, day after day, week after week, facing discomfort, danger, and the vast unknown, all for a belief. It was a profound expression of the medieval mind's blend of practicality and deep faith. In his own life, enclosed within the castle walls, he sometimes felt a different kind of journey, an internal pilgrimage through the halls of knowledge and the landscape of human emotion. But he admired those who braved the physical world, who walked thousands of miles for an idea, a prayer, a whisper of the divine. As the silence deepened around him, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl, Ilara imagined the endless procession of pilgrims, a silent river of faith flowing across the medieval landscape. Their footsteps echoing through the centuries, a testament to enduring hope on the long, winding path. The anticipation wasn't a burden, but merely a part of the elegant rhythm of his days and nights, a quiet breath before the next moment unfolded. Ilara, stirring from his thoughts of distant roads and pious wanderers, found his mind pulled back to the immediate sensory reality of the castle. A faint yet undeniable aroma began to waft into his chamber, even past the heavy tapestries and thick stone walls. It was the scent of dinner, not just a promise of sustenance, but a complex tapestry of odors. Roasted meat, simmering herbs, and the sweet tang of something baked. And with that, his thoughts turned from the grand journeys of faith to the humble, yet utterly vital apothecary's garden and the fascinating, flavorful world of medieval cuisine. For all the talk of knights and castles, lords and ladies, the true heart of any medieval household, especially one as grand as the Duke's, was arguably its kitchen. It was a place of perpetual controlled chaos, a smoky, noisy cavern where massive fireplaces roared, spits turned endlessly, and a small army of cooks and scullery maids waged a daily war against hunger. It smelled of fat fire and 1,000 different ingredients, a powerful scent that contrasted sharply with Ilara's rosewater-scented chambers. If the rest of the castle was a silent opera, The kitchen was its loud, boisterous, utterly essential percussion section. In an age before refrigerators and fancy preservatives, herbs and spices weren't just about making food taste good. They were essential for survival, for health, and for showing off your wealth. They were the medieval equivalent of your entire spice rack, medicine cabinet, and air freshener all rolled into one. Think of them as the unsung heroes of medieval banquets. Why were they so crucial? Well, for one, flavor. Medieval palates were different, often preferring strong, bold tastes. They weren't shy with spices, and a dish might contain several, all vying for attention. It was less about subtle notes and more about a full-blown orchestral performance in your mouth. But beyond that, spices were vital for preservation. Lacking reliable refrigeration, cooks relied on salt-drying smoking, and yes, liberal amounts of potent spices to help keep food from spoiling too quickly. A pinch of this, a dash of that, could mean the difference between a delicious meal and a rather unpleasant trip to the privy. And let's be honest, sometimes these potent flavors were also used to mask the taste of food that was, shall we say, a little past its prime. Nobody liked to waste food, especially meat, which was expensive and hard-won. So if that stewed pigeon had a hint of a questionable aroma, a generous sprinkling of something pungent like ginger or cloves could make it much more palatable. It was the original, put a bird on it, but for flavor and less about artisanal crafts. Crucially, many herbs and spices also had recognized medicinal properties. The line between cook, apothecary, and doctor was often quite blurry. A dish might be seasoned not just for taste, but because a specific herb was known to aid digestion, reduce fever, or ward off illness. Food was literally medicine, and medicine was often just very strongly flavored food. And then there was the status symbol aspect. Exotic spices brought from far-off lands along perilous trade routes were incredibly expensive. Imagine paying a small fortune for a spoonful of pepper. To serve a dish heavily spiced with saffron, with its vibrant golden color and unique earthy aroma, or with warming cinnamon and fragrant nutmeg, was a clear declaration of wealth and power. It was the medieval equivalent of serving caviar at a dinner party, a subtle flex of financial muscle. Saffron in particular was used not just for flavor, but to give dishes a rich golden hue, making them look even more appetizing and luxurious. It was literally coloring your food with gold dust. Back in the Duke's own apothecary garden, a smaller, meticulously tended plot. Within the castle walls grew the more common, but no less important herbs. Sage, robust and earthy, was a staple for seasoning meats. Thyme with its delicate woody notes and parsley, fresh and green, were used almost universally. You'd find dill and fennel for fish, and savory dishes, mint for refreshing drinks or sweet pastries, and rosemary, of course, for remembrance, but also for its pungent, piney flavor that paired beautifully with roasted lamb. The gardeners who tended these plots were often incredibly knowledgeable, understanding the growing cycles, the best times for harvest, and the specific properties of each plant. They were the unsung botanists of their age, ensuring a steady supply of both culinary delights and simple remedies. It was a vital collaboration between the green thumb and the iron pot. As for the actual medieval cuisine, it was far from bland. Meats like venison, boar beef, and various fowl were often roasted whole on spits, a grand spectacle that filled the hall with the aroma of crackling fat. Pottages and stews were incredibly popular, humble but hearty dishes made by simmering various meats, vegetables, and grains together for hours, allowing the flavors to meld into a comforting, thick concoction. These were the ultimate slow cooker meals designed to feed many people with whatever ingredients were at hand, layering flavors over a long period. Pies and tarts were also common, with thick crusts, often serving as edible containers rather than just being for flavor. They might contain savory fillings of meat and vegetables, or sweet fillings of fruit and honey. Speaking of sweetness, honey was the primary sweetener, as sugar was still a costly import, considered a luxury. Fruits like apples, pears, and berries were also used extensively in both sweet and savory dishes, providing a natural tartness or sweetness. A medieval feast was a sight to behold, a lavish display of wealth and culinary skill. Dishes would be piled high, often sculpted into fantastical shapes, or dyed with vibrant colors using those precious spices like saffron or beetroot. Imagine a peacock reassembled with its feathers, or a boar's head adorned with gilded tusks. It was less about refined dining and more about grand spectacle, an edible pageant designed to impress and delight. Even everyday meals, while simpler, still relied on the careful balance of flavors provided by herbs and spices. The type and quantity of food served were powerful social markers. The Lord's table would groan under the weight of exotic meats and expensive spices, while the servants might subsist on simpler pottages and less refined cuts. Food was not just fuel. It was a language speaking volumes about one's place in the hierarchy, one's power, and one's access to the wider world through trade. Ilara, as a privileged member of the Duke's household, enjoyed the very best of this culinary world. He tasted the fragrant stews, the succulent roasted meats, and the sweet spiced tarts. He knew the difference between a dish seasoned with precious imported cloves and one relying solely on common garden sage. He appreciated the intricate dance between cook and gardener, the way the bounty of the earth and the skill of human hands combine to create not just sustenance, but expressions of culture, wealth, and artistry. As he inhaled the lingering scent of the evening meal, a quiet, satisfied sigh escaped him. The journey from the quiet of his chamber to the distant clang of the blacksmith, and now to the fragrant hearth of the kitchen, was a testament to the rich, multifaceted symphony of medieval life, played out in sights, sounds, and most certainly flavors. As the last lingering scent of roasted capon faded, Ilara found his thoughts drifting from the human bustle of the castle to its more primal inhabitants. For a medieval person, animals weren't just cute companions or a source of dinner. They were everywhere, woven into the very fabric of daily existence, thought, and art, embodying a strange blend of the practical and the profoundly symbolic. It was a time when a lion could be both a majestic beast in a faraway land and a deeply Christian allegory, sometimes even on the same stained glass window. Let's start with the real-life roommates. The horses, for instance, were absolutely indispensable. They were the engines of the medieval world, the fast cars and delivery trucks, all rolled into one magnificent neighing package. Knights depended on their powerful war horses for battle, a relationship often closer than many human bonds. Messengers relied on swift mounts to carry vital news across treacherous lands. Farmers used draft horses to pull plows, turning the earth that fed everyone. Without horses, medieval life as they knew it would have ground to a halt, or at least slowed to a rather inconvenient crawl. Their presence filled the stables with a comforting warmth, and the clatter of hooves on cobblestones was a constant, reassuring sound. Then there were the dogs. Oh, the dogs! These weren't pampered pooches sitting on velvet cushions, though noble ladies certainly had their share of small, fluffy lapdogs. Medieval dogs were workers. There were the powerful hunting hounds, lean and swift, used to track boar and deer through the sprawling forests. Imagine a pack of these eager fellows baying excitedly, their noses to the ground, a blur of fur and muscle. Then there were the loyal watchdogs, their barks a first line of defense against intruders, their presence a constant reassurance in the dark medieval night. Even the scruffy curs that roamed the castle grounds played a role, acting as impromptu refuse disposal units, cleaning up scraps that might otherwise fester. They were the unsung heroes of medieval sanitation, if a little smelly. Cats, on the other hand, had a more complicated relationship with humans. While appreciated for their moosing skills, essential in a world where rodents were a constant threat to grain stores and parchment scrolls, they were also sometimes viewed with suspicion, particularly black cats, who were often linked to witchcraft and dark magic. It was a tough gig being a medieval cat. One day you're saving the harvest, the next, you're being eyed suspiciously by the local witch hunter. Talk about a precarious career path. Beyond these everyday animals, the medieval mind was also utterly captivated by the creatures that existed more in lore than in reality. These fantastic beasts were often catalogued in bestiaries, those fascinating illustrated books Ilara sometimes perused in the library. These bestiaries weren't zoology textbooks in the modern sense. They were moral lessons disguised as animal encyclopedias. Every creature, real or imagined, was given a symbolic meaning often tied to Christian theology. It was like a medieval self-help book, using animals as cautionary tales or inspiring examples. The unicorn, for instance. This elusive, pure white horse with a single spiraling horn was the ultimate symbol of purity, innocence, and chastity. It was said that only a virgin could tame a unicorn, making it a favorite motif for depicting the Virgin Mary. Imagine trying to explain to a modern person that the mythical beast they know from children's stories was once a powerful religious symbol, almost as revered as a saint. Then there were the griffins. Majestic creatures with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle. They symbolized strength, courage, and divine power, often guarding treasures or sacred places. They were like the medieval superheroes, combining the best parts of two apex predators into one formidable package. You definitely wouldn't want to meet one of those in a dark alley unless you were looking for some very heavy-duty security. And of course, the dragon. These fiery, scaly behemoths were almost universally symbols of evil chaos and the devil himself. Slaying a dragon was the ultimate act of heroism, a triumph of good over evil, much like a knight fighting a monstrous manifestation of sin. Every heroic tale worth its salt featured a dragon that needed a good sword poking. They were the ultimate medieval villains, breathing fire and hoarding gold with an efficiency that would make any modern banker jealous. These mythical creatures weren't just confined to dusty books. They appeared everywhere. You'd find them carved into the stone of cathedral gargoyles glaring down at sinners from high above. They adorned the heraldry of noble families, each beast symbolizing a particular virtue or characteristic the family wished to project. A lion for courage, an eagle for nobility, a serpent for wisdom or cunning. Your family crest was basically your medieval personal branding, and the animals you chose said a lot about your aspirations. They were woven into tapestries, their vibrant forms bringing stories to life on castle walls. They were painted into the borders of illuminated manuscripts, sometimes interacting with the human figures in humorous or grotesque ways. Imagine tiny, mischievous monkeys playing pranks in the margins of a solemn religious text. Medieval humor was delightfully uninhibited at times. Animals, both real and imagined, provided a rich visual language, a way to convey complex ideas and emotions without words. Even the everyday interactions with animals were layered with meaning. The faithful dog at your feet, the soaring hawk on your wrist, the humble ox pulling your plow. Each had its place in the great chain of being, and each offered lessons about loyalty, patience, or the natural order of the world. Animals were reflections of humanity, embodying virtues and vices, triumphs and failings. As Ilara sat in his chamber, the gentle glow of the lamp illuminating his thoughts. He imagined the castle populated not just by people, but by a vibrant menagerie of creatures, both seen and unseen. The rhythmic snorting of horses from the stable, the sleepy sigh of a hound by the hearth, the imagined flutter of a griffin's wings high above the battlements. They were all part of the intricate living tapestry of the medieval world, a constant reminder that humanity shared its space with a vast, fascinating, and sometimes terrifying animal kingdom. From the practicalities of a working farm animal to the profound symbolism of a mythical beast, the animal world provided not just sustenance and service, but also a rich source of inspiration, wonder, and profound meaning for those who lived under the watchful eye of both man and beast. As Ilara sat contemplating the intricate web of life within and beyond the castle, his gaze drifted to the rich tapestry that hung on his chamber wall, depicting a hunting scene with a noble lady in flowing robes. It wasn't just a decoration. It was a silent testament to another vital yet often overlooked aspect of medieval life, the world of textiles fashion, and how clothing screamed your social status louder than any herald's trumpet. In the Middle Ages, what you wore wasn't just about keeping warm or looking pretty. It was a language, a complex code understood by everyone, from the humblest peasant to the loftiest king. Your clothes told a story about who you were, what you did, and how much silver you had jingling in your purse, or more accurately tucked into your belt. It was like a medieval billboard advertisement for your entire life, and everyone was reading it. Let's start with the basics, the materials. For most people, wool was the undisputed king. It was warm, durable, and readily available from the endless flocks of sheep dotting the landscape. Wool could be coarse and scratchy for the common folk, or finely spun and soft for the nobility. Then there was linen made from flax plants. Lighter and cooler than wool, it was perfect for undergarments, shirts, and summer wear. It was the medieval equivalent of breathable cotton, a godsend in a hot, crowded hall. But the real showstopper, the fabric that made everyone gasp, was silk. Imported from the distant exotic East along the Silk Road, silk was eye-wateringly expensive, a luxury reserved exclusively for the super-rich. Wearing silk was like parading around with a diamond necklace. It shimmered, it draped beautifully, and it felt utterly luxurious against the skin. It was the ultimate flex, a clear sign that you had serious coin and connections. The journey from raw fiber to finished garment was a laborious, time-consuming process. First came spinning, often done by women turning raw wool or flax into thread, using a drop spindle or a spinning wheel. This was slow, repetitive work, but absolutely essential. Then came weaving done on large looms, interlacing threads to create fabric. This could be done at home for simple cloths or in specialized workshops for more complex weaves. Imagine the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of looms, a constant backdrop sound in many medieval towns. And then there was dyeing. This was where the magic happened, transforming dull, natural fibers into vibrant hues. Dyes were made from natural sources: woad, or indigo for blue's madder root, for reds, weld for yellows, and various bark sleeves and insects for other colors. Achieving a deep, rich color was a skill and often involved multiple dyeing baths and a lot of patience. Bright, fast colors were highly prized and often indicated higher quality and greater expense. A bright scarlet gown wasn't just red. It was, "I'm important and I can afford expensive bugs," red. The finished fabrics were then cut and sewn into clothing, often by household servants or skilled tailors in towns. The designs were relatively simple by modern standards: tunics, gowns, cloaks. But the fit and embellishments made all the difference. Seams were hand-stitched, often with remarkable precision, and garments were designed to be layered, providing warmth and allowing for adaptable outfits. But more than material or cut clothing was the ultimate marker of social status. You could tell a person's rank at a glance. Peasants wore simple undyed wool or linen tunics, often coarse and practical, designed for hard labor. Their colors were muted, their garments durable. They didn't have time for fashion trends. They had fields to plow. Moving up the ladder, townspeople and merchants might wear brighter colors, perhaps some simple embroidery and fabrics of better quality. They had a little more disposable income, and their clothes reflected their rising prosperity. They were the ones starting to experiment with new styles, albeit cautiously. Then came the nobility and royalty. Their clothing was an explosion of color, luxury, and ostentation. They wore rich silks, fine wools, and sometimes even fabrics interwoven with gold or silver thread. Their garments were often heavily embroidered with intricate patterns, sometimes even adorned with jewels or pearls. Their cloaks might be lined with expensive furs like ermine or sable, signaling immense wealth and power. For them, dressing was a performance, a constant visual reaffirmation of their elite status. A king's robe wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a moving throne designed to inspire awe and respect. To keep everyone in their place, many regions had sumptuary laws. These were laws that dictated what certain classes of people were allowed to wear, often specifying fabrics, colors, and embellishments. A commoner might be forbidden from wearing silk or purple, or certain types of fur, no matter how much money they might have. It was the medieval equivalent of saying, "Sorry, your social security number doesn't qualify you for this designer handbag." These laws were designed to maintain social order, prevent excessive displays of wealth by the wrong people, and keep everyone firmly in their prescribed lane. Fashion trends, though slower to evolve than today, certainly existed. Styles in one region might differ from another, and silhouettes changed over the centuries. In the early Middle Ages, clothing was often looser and simpler. As the period progressed, styles became more fitted, more elaborate with longer sleeves, more complex draping, and increasingly fantastical headwear for women. The 14th and 15th centuries saw some truly outrageous hats, towering structures that made doorways a challenge. It seems the desire to make a statement with your head has always been a thing. Ilara, as a valued member of the Duke's intimate household, wore clothes that blended comfort with understated luxury. His silks were of the finest quality, his wools soft and expertly dyed, but without the gaudy excess of some newly rich merchants or the stiff formality of a great lord's ceremonial robes. His attire was a reflection of his peculiar privileged position, not quite nobility by birth, but certainly above the common folk, embodying the refined taste of his patron. He dressed to be pleasing to the eye, yes, but also to be comfortable in his own skin, literally. He often observed the various costumes of the court, a silent commentator on the shifting tides of fashion and status. He could tell at a glance who was trying too hard, who was subtly declining in favor, and who was genuinely at the pinnacle of power simply by the cut of their tunic or the quality of their fur lining. The rustle of a silken gown, the sturdy practicality of a wool tunic, the gleam of embroidered gold thread. These were not just sounds and sights, but stories unfolding silent narratives of status, wealth, and identity in the grand theater of the medieval court. And as he gazed at the tapestry, he felt a deeper appreciation for the anonymous weavers, dyers, and tailors who spun the very fabric of medieval life, creating a vibrant visual language understood by all. As the evening deepened, Ilara often found himself drawn to the high windows of the Duke's private solar, away from the hum of courtly chatter. Beyond the castle walls, the night sky was a breathtaking canvas, unblemished by the urban glow, that would one day obscure its glory. Here the stars weren't just pretty twinkles. They were a map, a clock, and a book of prophecies profoundly influencing the medieval mind. This was the realm of stars and prophecies where astronomy and astrology were intertwined, like two threads in a celestial tapestry, and the heavens whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. To us, astronomy is the study of the stars, planets and galaxies as physical objects, while astrology is the belief that these celestial bodies influence human events and personalities. In the Middle Ages, however, these two disciplines were practically inseparable, like two sides of the same very shiny, very important coin. A scholar who studied the movements of the planets was almost certainly also calculating horoscopes, because why wouldn't they? If God put the stars there, surely they had a message for humanity, right? It was a logical leap that made perfect sense in a world where everything was seen through a divine lens. The medieval cosmos, as they understood it, was a tidy if somewhat geocentric affair. They believed in a Ptolemaic system where the Earth was the unmoving center of the universe and everything else, the Moon, the Sun, the known planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then the sphere of fixed stars, revolved around it in perfect crystalline spheres. It was an elegant, if incorrect model, like a beautifully crafted but ultimately wrong miniature solar system. The heavens were seen as perfect and unchanging, a stark contrast to the messy, imperfect earth below. Scholars and monks, often the most educated people of the time, meticulously observed the night sky. They used basic but ingenious instruments. The astrolabe, for instance, was a remarkable piece of technology, a brass disc with rotating plates that could be used to measure the altitude of celestial bodies, tell time, and even figure out your latitude. It was the medieval equivalent of a smartphone with a built-in GPS and a calendar all rolled into one beautiful, cumbersome device. They also used armillary spheres' intricate models of the celestial spheres to visualize the movements of the planets. These were less for direct observation and more for teaching and understanding the cosmic dance. But the real meat of their celestial interest lay in astrology. Every important decision, from a king launching a war to a merchant setting sail, from a doctor prescribing a cure to a farmer planting crops, might be influenced by the stars. Before a royal wedding, an astrologer might be consulted to determine the most auspicious day for the ceremony. A battle commander might consult the heavens to find the perfect moment to attack, hoping the planets were aligned in his favor. It was like having a cosmic weather forecast for your life, only instead of rain. It predicted misfortune, and instead of sunshine, it promised glory. The belief was that each planet had specific influences. Mars, red and fiery, was associated with war, aggression, and passion. If Mars was in a dominant position in your birth chart, you might be destined for a military career, or perhaps just a very fiery temper. Venus, bright and beautiful, governed love, beauty, and harmony. A strong Venus meant you were likely to be charming, artistic, or just very good at attracting admirers. Jupiter, the largest known planet, was linked to prosperity, wisdom, and good fortune, while Saturn, slow and distant, often signified melancholy, hardship, and contemplation. The moon influenced tides and cycles, and was thought to affect moods and fertility, while the sun naturally was associated with vitality, leadership, and the very essence of life. Horoscopes were a big deal. When a baby was born, a skilled astrologer might be called upon to cast a birth chart, meticulously charting the positions of the planets and stars at that exact moment. This chart was then used to interpret the child's character, future, and destiny. It was like a medieval personality test and a life plan, all in one neat package. Of course, interpretations varied wildly, and a good astrologer knew how to couch their predictions in enough ambiguity to cover all bases, much like a skilled politician. You will experience great challenges, but also great triumphs. A safe bet for anyone, really. Even the human body was thought to be intricately linked to the cosmos. Medieval medicine, as Ilara knew from his earlier musings, operated on the humoral theory, but astrologers often applied planetary influences to specific parts of the body or to particular diseases. For example, a stomach ailment might be associated with a certain planet, and the remedy might involve herbs picked under a specific planetary alignment. It was holistic medicine with a cosmic twist, trying to treat the whole person from their humors to their horoscope. The intersection of astrology with Christian theology was a tricky dance. While the Church generally condemned outright divination and fatalism, many respected scholars and even popes consulted astrologers. It was often argued that God created the stars and their movements, so studying them was merely understanding God's divine plan rather than challenging it. It was a careful tightrope walk between faith and what they considered a legitimate, if sometimes misapplied form of scientific inquiry. They weren't trying to defy God, just to read his very elaborate celestial handwriting. As Ilara looked out at the velvet curtain of night sprinkled with diamonds, he felt a strange connection to those ancient stargazers, those patient observers who spent their nights charting the heavens. In a world without electric lights, the night sky truly dominated, becoming an undeniable presence. It was a source of wonder, certainly, but also a source of practical guidance and philosophical contemplation. The stars weren't just distant pinpricks. They were living entities constantly broadcasting messages influencing the destinies of kings and commoners alike. The medieval cosmos was a vibrant, active participant in human life, a silent, all-encompassing force that shaped beliefs, guided decisions, and filled the human heart with both awe and a comforting sense of order. And as a particularly bright star twinkled, Ilara imagined it was winking, sharing a cosmic secret, a silent affirmation of the enduring power of the heavens over the small, bustling world below. His thoughts, drifting from the grand celestial order, then turned to a different kind of order, one far more earthly, yet equally structured and devoted the quiet, disciplined life within the walls of a medieval monastery. While his own existence within the Duke's court was one of refined indulgence, a monastery represented a stark contrast. A world deliberately set apart from the secular clamor dedicated wholly to God and to the painstaking preservation of knowledge. Imagine a place where the loudest sound is often the rustle of parchment or the murmur of prayer, where time is marked not by the sun's passage across a banquet hall, but by the rhythmic tolling of bells for worship. This was the monastic life, a steady, unchanging pulse at the very heart of medieval society. Monks and nuns, having forsworn worldly pleasures and possessions, committed their lives to spiritual devotion, communal living, and often diligent labor. It was like a very exclusive, very long retreat, where the main goal was spiritual perfection and surprisingly good beer, depending on the abbey. The daily routine of a medieval monk or nun was, to put it mildly, rigorous. Their days were meticulously structured around the divine office, a series of prayers and services performed at specific hours starting long before dawn. The first call to prayer matins might ring out when it was still pitch black outside, often around 2 or 3 a.m. Picture dragging yourself out of a warm bed in the freezing cold, shuffling to a dimly lit chapel, and spending hours chanting. It required serious dedication, or perhaps just a very strong caffeine substitute. This pattern continued throughout the day. Lauds at sunrise prime at the first hour, terce at the third, sext at the sixth, none at the ninth, vespers in the evening, and finally, compline before bed. It was a spiritual alarm clock that never stopped ringing. Between these hours of prayer, monks and nuns engaged in various forms of labor. The Benedictine motto, ora et labora, pray and work, perfectly encapsulated their philosophy. For many, this meant agricultural work. Monasteries were often vast landowners, and the monks themselves, or lay brothers, would work the fields, tend livestock, and cultivate gardens. They were pioneers in farming techniques, experimenting with crop rotation, drainage, and animal husbandry, effectively becoming agricultural research stations of their time. They grew not just food for themselves, but often produced a surplus that could feed local communities or be sold in markets. Another crucial form of labor was study and scholarship. This is where monasteries truly shone as beacons of knowledge. In a world where literacy was rare and books were precious commodities, monasteries were the guardians of learning. Monks dedicated hours to reading, copying manuscripts, and even composing their own works. The scriptorium, a special room for writing, was the quiet engine of intellectual life. Here scribes would painstakingly copy religious texts, classical literature, and scientific treatises, often preserving works that would otherwise have been lost to history. They literally kept knowledge alive, one meticulously copied page at a time. Without them, we might know a lot less about ancient Greece and Rome, and definitely fewer funny marginalia in old books. Beyond copying, many monasteries had extensive libraries filled with precious hand-copied books. These were not just places for storage. They were vibrant centers of intellectual activity where monks could research, debate, and teach. Some monasteries even ran schools for young boys, providing an education that was often unavailable elsewhere. They were the universities, the publishing houses, and the archives all rolled into one, a medieval Google, if you had to physically go there and hand copy the results. The architecture of a medieval monastery was designed to facilitate this disciplined life. At its heart was usually a cloister, a square courtyard surrounded by covered walkways. This provided a peaceful, sheltered space for meditation, reading, or quiet conversation, a tranquil oasis away from the elements. Around the cloister would be the church or chapel, the refectory dining hall, the dormitory sleeping quarters, the chapter house for meetings, and the scriptorium. Every space had a purpose, every stone contributing to the ordered flow of monastic life. The very stones seemed to breathe peace. While the primary focus was spiritual, monasteries were far from isolated ivory towers. They played a vital social and economic role in their communities. They provided alms to the poor, cared for the sick, often with their own infirmaries and apothecary gardens, and offered hospitality to travelers and pilgrims. They were like medieval social service centers, offering spiritual guidance, medical care, and a safe haven to anyone who needed it. Many also served as centers of craft production, brewing beer, making wine, baking bread, and even producing textiles. They were self-sufficient economic powerhouses, contributing significantly to the local economy. Life in a monastery wasn't without its challenges, of course. Strict rules, long hours, and periods of silence or fasting could be demanding. But for many, it offered a sense of purpose, community, and intellectual fulfillment that was hard to find in the turbulent secular world. It was a refuge for scholars, artists, and devout individuals who sought a life dedicated to higher pursuits, away from the endless squabbles over land and power. Ilara had occasionally visited the small monastic house affiliated with the Duke's lands, a quiet place nestled in a valley just a day's ride from the castle. He admired the monks' dedication, their quiet strength, and the palpable sense of peace that permeated their ancient walls. He saw the wisdom in their structured days, the simple beauty of their communal life. While his own days were filled with the subtle complexities of courtly duty, theirs were defined by a profound simplicity and a clear sense of divine purpose. As the last lamp flickered in his own chamber, Ilara imagined the monks even now, perhaps rising for matins, their voices rising in unison, a low, resonant chant echoing through the cold stone chapel. It was a sound as ancient as the stars, a steady rhythm of faith and devotion that had anchored the medieval world for centuries. Monasteries, he realized, were not just buildings. They were living institutions, constantly praying, working and preserving the very soul of their age. They were the quiet, tireless engines of medieval learning and spirituality, a powerful counterpoint to the more flamboyant, yet ultimately fleeting pursuits of the secular world, truly the quiet heroes of a noisy age. As Ilara's thoughts drifted from the orderly, pious world of the monastery, his mind took a less structured, more meandering path, venturing into the shadowy, often whimsical realm of medieval folklore, fairies, and superstition. This was the unwritten history, the tales whispered by firelight, the beliefs that governed the everyday lives of common folk, often mixing ancient pagan fears with a surprisingly flexible interpretation of Christian doctrine. It was a world where a misplaced shoe could invite bad luck, and a rustle in the woods might just be a mischievous sprite rather than a startled deer. Imagine a world without streetlights, where the night was truly dark, thick and inky, pressing in on isolated villages and lonely roads. In such a world, it was easy to believe that hidden things lurked just beyond the firelight. The forests, vast and ancient, were particularly potent places for medieval imagination. They weren't just collections of trees. They were enchanted realms home to strange creatures and powerful spirits. A knight might ride through them with courage, but even he'd probably make sure his spurs were sharp and his prayers were said. At the heart of much medieval folklore were the fairies and forest spirits. These weren't necessarily the sparkly, benevolent little winged beings of later children's tales. Oh no, medieval fairies were far more capricious, often dangerous, and always to be treated with extreme caution. They could be beautiful, alluring, and enchanting, but just as quickly turn malevolent, leading travelers astray with illusions or stealing babies from their cradles, leaving changelings in their place. They were the medieval equivalent of an unhinged prankster with magical powers, and you definitely didn't want to get on their bad side. People left offerings of milk or bread on their doorsteps, not necessarily out of love, but more out of a desperate hope to appease these unseen neighbors and avoid their wrath. Alongside fairies, there were other elemental spirits, goblins who lived in caves and played tricks on miners' brownies, who secretly helped with household chores if you left them a bowl of cream, and various water spirits who dwelled in rivers and lakes, sometimes luring unwary travelers to their watery doom. It was a crowded, supernatural neighborhood, and medieval people walked a delicate line, trying to avoid offense while still benefiting from any potential goodwill. Superstitions permeated every aspect of daily life, from birth to death. Friday the 13th. A bad omen, perhaps, but medieval folk had a whole calendar of unlucky days. Spilling salt was a sign of misfortune. A black cat crossing your path was definitely not good news. You'd throw salt over your shoulder to ward off evil, or wear a protective amulet to keep away illness. It was a constant, subtle dance of precautions and charms, a way to exert some control over an unpredictable world. Think of it as a low-level, continuous magical battle against invisible forces. Farmers in particular lived by these beliefs. Charms to ensure a good harvest, rituals to protect livestock from disease, and blessings for the fertility of the land were commonplace. They might consult local wise women or cunning folk, not necessarily witches, but people believed to have knowledge of old traditions and herbal remedies, blending a bit of magic with practical experience. It was folk medicine, often with a dash of "don't upset the local tree spirit." The evil eye was a widespread fear. If someone looked at you with envy or ill will, They could unwittingly or sometimes deliberately cast a curse, bringing misfortune or sickness. To protect yourself, you might wear certain symbols like a horseshoe, or make specific gestures such as crossing your fingers. It was a constant vigilance, a subtle defense against the unseen malevolence of others. Folk remedies were another fascinating blend of the practical and the superstitious. For a headache, you might apply a poultice of herbs, but you might also recite a charm or tie a specific knot in a piece of string. Healing was often seen as a spiritual as well as a physical process. Bone setters, tooth pullers, and herbalists were common, relying on centuries of inherited knowledge passed down through generations, often blending practical skill with a hefty dose of ritual. It was a bit like going to the doctor, but your diagnosis might involve inspecting animal entrails and your prescription a magic chant. The church, for its part, had a complicated relationship with this vibrant tapestry of folklore. On one hand, it actively condemned overt pagan practices, witchcraft, and anything that smacked of devil worship. On the other hand, many local saints' cults incorporated older pre-Christian traditions and popular Christian practices, often intertwined with folk beliefs. For example, holy wells. Once pagan sacred sites became associated with Christian saints and continued to be places of healing and pilgrimage. It was a shrewd move by the church, often absorbing and Christianizing existing beliefs rather than trying to stamp them out entirely. It was like rebranding an old product rather than trying to launch a completely new one from scratch. Storytelling was the primary vehicle for transmitting these beliefs. Around the hearth on long winter nights, or in taverns after a day's work, tales were spun of mischievous pucks, of benevolent house spirits, of terrifying witches, and of heroes who outsmarted cunning monsters. These weren't just entertainment. They were cautionary tales, moral lessons, and repositories of local wisdom passed from generation to generation, keeping the old ways alive in the collective memory. Elara, despite his noble status, often loved to listen to the more earthy, less refined tales told by the palace servants, finding in them a raw vitality missing from his more polished courtly literature. The fear of witches and sorcerers also grew stronger towards the later Middle Ages. While initially seen as more akin to cunning folk or local healers, the growing power of the church and changing social anxieties led to a darker perception. Witchcraft was increasingly associated with heresy and devil worship, leading to the persecution and trials that would become more intense in later centuries. It was a terrifying shift, transforming quirky local characters into figures of malevolent power, a dangerous consequence of fear and misunderstanding. As Elara sat in his chamber, the gentle glow of the oil lamp pushing back the oppressive darkness, he imagined the unseen world bustling just beyond the veil of perception. The wind rattling the shutters seemed to carry whispers of ancient spirits, and the shadows dancing on the wall might almost be a fairy flitting by. For all the sophistication of court life, the precision of astronomy, or the meticulous craft of manuscript illumination, the medieval world remained deeply rooted in a rich, vibrant, and often fearful world of magic and mystery. It was a reminder that even in an age of faith and reason, the human imagination, particularly when confronted by the vast unknown forces of nature, continued to conjure wonders and terrors, filling the forests, rivers, and very homes with the enchanting and sometimes terrifying presence of folklore and the enduring power of ancient beliefs. As Elara sat the shadows of medieval folklore dancing in his mind, he realized how interconnected everything was, from the stars above to the superstitions below. Yet there was another, even broader web of connection that truly defined the medieval world, one that stretched far beyond the castle walls, over mountains and across restless seas, the intricate network of trade routes and cross-cultural exchange. Imagine for a moment that the medieval world wasn't just a collection of isolated kingdoms, each stewing in its own local customs and conflicts. Oh no, it was a dynamic, bustling marketplace of goods ideas, and people all flowing along arteries that were as vital as any river. These were the superhighways of their time, connecting distant lands and allowing cultures to mingle, borrow, and influence one another in ways that would surprise many. It was like a very slow, very arduous, but incredibly influential global supply chain, where exotic spices might travel further than any knight in shining armor. At the heart of this network were the rivers and sea routes. Before the age of paved roads and motor wagons, water was often the fastest and most efficient way to transport large quantities of goods. The great rivers of Europe, the Rhine, the Danube, the Seine, were bustling thoroughfares, their banks dotted with towns and markets that thrived on the constant flow of traffic. Barges laden with timber, grain, wine, and wool drifted lazily downstream, or were painstakingly pulled upstream by teams of men or oxen. These weren't just pretty waterways. They were economic lifelines humming with the quiet industry of commerce. But the real long-distance heroes were the sea routes, from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. From the Atlantic coasts to the far-off shores of Asia, ships were the primary vessels for connecting the medieval world. Venetian and Genoese merchants, like intrepid venture capitalists, crisscrossed the Mediterranean, bringing silk, spices, and precious jewels from the east to the eager markets of Europe. The Hanseatic League, a powerful confederation of trading cities in northern Europe, dominated the Baltic and North Seas, exchanging timber, furs, fish, and grain, their ships bustling like busy bees. These were not pleasure cruises. These were voyages fraught with danger, storms, pirates, and the sheer unpredictability of the open water. Every successful journey was a testament to courage, seamanship, and a healthy dose of luck. These trade routes weren't just about moving goods. They were conduits for cross-cultural exchange. Ideas flowed as freely as spices. Think about the influence of the Islamic world on medieval Europe. During what some call the Dark Ages in Europe, the Islamic Golden Age was shining brightly, preserving and advancing knowledge from ancient Greece and Rome, and making incredible strides in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Arab scholars translated ancient texts, added their own brilliant commentaries, and then these works slowly, steadily filtered into Europe. Imagine a European scholar poring over an Arabic translation of Aristotle, or learning about complex algebraic equations from a text by Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gave us algorithm. This wasn't just borrowing. It was a fundamental reshaping of European thought. Hospitals in Islamic lands were far more advanced than their European counterparts, and medical knowledge flowed from east to west, slowly improving practices that were still steeped in humoral theory and superstition. Even the numeral system we use today, the Arabic numerals 09, traveled across these routes, slowly replacing the cumbersome Roman numerals, making calculations infinitely easier. It was like finally getting a calculator after doing math with pebbles and sticks. Beyond knowledge, goods themselves fostered interaction. Silks from China, spices from India and the Spice Islands, exquisite carpets from Persia, and finely crafted metalwork from the Middle East all made their way to European markets. These exotic imports sparked demand, fueled exploration, and broadened horizons. They made medieval lords and ladies dream of distant lands filled with wonders they could now touch, smell, and taste. But the flow wasn't just one way. European goods like wool cloth, timber metals, and slaves, a regrettable reality of the time, also traveled east, creating a complex web of economic interdependence. Merchants from different cultures haggled, formed alliances, and learned about each other's customs and languages. Trading outposts became multicultural melting pots, vibrant hubs where different worlds collided and mingled. The Crusades, despite their violent origins, also facilitated significant cross-cultural exchange. European knights and pilgrims venturing into the Holy Land encountered sophisticated Islamic societies with advanced cities, dazzling architecture, and a wealth of learning. They brought back not just religious fervor, but new ideas, new foods, like sugar lemons and apricots, and a newfound appreciation for Eastern craftsmanship. It was a brutal way to go sightseeing, but it certainly left an impression. Even small things contributed. New musical instruments like the lute, which Alara himself enjoyed playing, and new culinary techniques traveled along these routes. The very spices in the Duke's kitchen, which Alara had thought about earlier, were themselves testaments to this vast global network, each grain a tiny ambassador from a faraway land. The grand narrative of the medieval world therefore wasn't just about castles and kings, peasants, and priests. It was also about the indefatigable merchant, the daring sailor, and the patient caravan leader, all pushing the boundaries of the known world, driven by profit curiosity and the simple desire for connection. They were the original globalists, stitching together disparate cultures with threads of commerce and curiosity. As Alara sat in his chamber, the gentle night wind a reminder of unseen journeys, he felt a profound sense of awe at this vast, intricate dance of human interaction. The castle, for all its imposing stone walls, was not an island. It was part of a much larger, constantly moving tapestry, woven from the trade of goods, the exchange of ideas, and the endless flow of people. From the humblest peasant trading at a local market to the grand merchant fleet returning from distant shores, every interaction, every exchange contributed to the vibrant, interconnected pulse of medieval life. The world was far larger, far more dynamic, and far more connected than any single person, even the most learned, could fully grasp. And that, Ilara mused, was perhaps the greatest marvel of all. The quiet castle slept, but the unseen rivers of trade and ideas flowed on, carrying the medieval world into its future.